Mr. President, let me start by thanking Senator Baucus for putting forward his proposal on tax issues. It is a responsible course for us to follow. It's one that I can vote for without reservation. He's basically saying, look, let's ensure that the first $250,000 that is earned by any and all Americans in this next year will be subject to the lower tax rates that were put in place during President Bush's time in office, the tax rates that were adopted essentially in 2001. And of course, it also contains other very useful provisions to reinstate the estate tax at a reasonable rate with a significant amount exempted from the estate tax. It has provisions for energy tax, extending of energy tax provisions, which I think are very important to the country. But we had a good hearing yesterday in the Finance Committee. I'm privileged to serve on that committee that Senator Baucus chairs, and we had a very good hearing on the whole issue of federal revenues and outlays. And I thought some useful information came out there. I was able to speak very briefly with Doug Elmendorf, the head of the Congressional Budget Office, and I was particularly impressed with one chart that he presented in his materials, and I've made a copy of that essentially that I wanted to go through and explain, because I think it puts this entire discussion into context. This chart talks about what has happened with both outlays, and that's the light blue line, and revenues, the darker or black line. Outlays and revenues of the federal government for a 40-year period, starting in 1970 and ending essentially right now. And you can see that in that 40-year period, one useful thing about the chart is it has an average. And it says, on average, outlays were about nearly 21%, and that is the dotted blue line across here. And it also says, on average, revenues, what the government collects in taxes, was about 18%, and that's the dotted black line down here. So you can see that there is a, I don't know if you'd call it a structural gap, but a persistent gap between what we raise for the operation of the federal government and what we spend. And every year we spend more than we raise. Now there's an exception to that, and there's a period here that where these two lines cross, and that is the period at the end of the Clinton administration where we got to a balanced budget and a surplus. And that was achieved for a variety of reasons. And let me talk a little about those reasons. There was a four-year period there, 1998 through 2001, where the federal government essentially did not spend more than it took in. In 2001, again, as you can see from this chart, beginning in 2001 with this precipitous drop-off in revenue, the deficit began to grow. And we now have a very large deficit. And the particularly disturbing thing is that when you look ahead and project where we're going to be over the next 5, 10, 20 years, we are projected to have a very large deficit indefinitely unless we change some things. And changing either the outlay numbers, what we spend, or the revenue numbers, the level of taxes that are collected, is not easy. It's not easy in this Congress. It's never been easy. So how did we produce a surplus during the 4 years that we had a surplus? I think there were three main factors that account for that. In 1990, the Congress and President George H.W. Bush were able to agree to legislation that controlled spending and increased revenues as well. That was the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990. It enacted pay-go rules. It also increased taxes on the wealthiest Americans by raising the top income tax rate from 28% to 31%. At the time, President George H.W. Bush said, this is a quote from him, he says, "It's time, I think it's past time, to put the interests of the country first," end quote. So over the next 5 years, this legislation did reduce the deficit by a total of $480 billion. So that was one of the factors that got us to that period of a balanced budget and surplus. Second factor was in 1993 when the Congress and President Clinton agreed again to legislation to increase revenue and control spending. This legislation once again raised taxes on the wealthiest Americans. Over the 5 years following that, the legislation reduced the deficit by $430 billion, and revenue increases were responsible for over half of that deficit reduction that occurred in that period. And of course, the third factor, which is the most important, is that the country enjoyed very strong economic growth during the 1990s, particularly the latter part of the 1990s. That allowed revenues to rise above the historical average that we see down here, this 18% historical average for revenues. We were able to get that up significantly, both because of the changes in law that occurred under President George H.W. Bush and under President Clinton, and the very good economic circumstances that we enjoyed in the 1990s. So what caused the situation to reverse? Was it an increase in spending, or was it a decrease in revenue? I think this chart makes the point very clearly that initially what caused this situation to reverse was the Bush tax cuts of 2001. They reduced revenue by $70 billion in that exact year, that same year, 2001. In total, the tax cuts President George W. Bush signed into law reduced revenue by an estimated $1.6 trillion over a 10-year period. The actual cost may have been significantly greater. Simply put, the Congress and the President, when we enacted those Bush tax cuts, so-called Bush tax cuts, cut taxes more than we could afford to unless we were willing to also dramatically cut spending. And we did not cut spending. In fact, we increased spending. We increased it fairly dramatically to fund the Afghanistan war, to fund the Iraq war, to create Medicare Part D. None of that new spending was paid for. Former Congressional Budget Office and Office of Management and Budget Director Peter Orszag estimates that because they were not paid for, the Bush tax cuts, if extended again, and Medicare Part D, those together would add $5 trillion to the debt over the next decade. So the votes that we're casting here on this tax issue are significant votes that will reverberate for some time and affect our economy and our deficit and our debt. So people need to understand that. Of course, in the last 3 years, since we've been in this recession, the deficit has worsened very substantially. Revenue dropped to historic lows as the economy contracted. Spending also increased due to the Recovery Act and also due to the automatic stabilizers that we have built into the law, such as unemployment compensation. It's important to note that only about 10% of the debt that we have incurred over the next 10 years, the debt over the next 10 years, is due to the Recovery Act. Now, with the economic recovery underway, the size of the deficit is beginning to stabilize, and you can see that at the far right end part of this chart here, where you can see these numbers beginning to, you can see the outlay number beginning to come down, you can see the revenue number at least leveling off, and that is positive. But we can't solve, the obvious point that I think we need to understand is that we cannot solve the deficit problem by simply reverting to the situation before the economic crisis. The chart shows that on average, outlays have exceeded revenues by about 3% of gross domestic product. That's about $450 billion under our current size of our gross domestic product. In other words, if Congress can only accomplish an average performance, we are looking at a $500 billion deficit going forward, even after we are fully out of this recession. Clearly, we need to do better than that. Congress needs to make some tough choices, both to control spending and to increase revenues, just as we did in the 1990s. Both the President's Deficit Reduction Commission, which I know is having its final vote today, and the bipartisan commission led by my former colleague, Senator Pete Domenici and Alice Rivlin, former budget director, both of those commissions recognize that we will need revenue increases as well as spending cuts to solve the deficit problem. The proposal that Senator Baucus has come forward with is to allow everyone in the country to enjoy the lower tax rates that were adopted under President Bush, but only to enjoy those lower rates for the first $250,000 of income each year. I know Senator Schumer has a proposal which says we will allow the lower rates on taxation, earned income, to apply to the first $1 million of income of all Americans. So all Americans will get the tax cut, just as they will under the proposal by Senator Baucus. But Senator Schumer's proposal would be to give them the lower rates on the entire $1 million that they earn in the first year. Above that, they would have to go and pay the rates that were in place under President Clinton's time in office in the 1990s, when the economy was so strong. The question is, can we in this Congress do what needs to be done to deal with the deficit issue, and particularly on this tax bill, to do what needs to be done to raise revenue. Tomorrow, we'll be voting on whether to let the Bush tax cuts expire for income above $250,000. One of these votes will be to effectively raise on annual income above $1 million, as I said. Compared to other choices we have, it seems to me that this is a fairly easy choice. If we are not willing to revert to the Clinton-era tax rates on any income, no matter at what level, then it's going to be very, very difficult for us to make a credible claim that we are serious about the deficit. So I urge my colleagues to support the Baucus proposal, and I hope we can get a good, strong bipartisan vote on that. It's clear to me that Americans do want to see the taxes that they are paying on the first $250,000 of their income remain where they are today. That will only happen if we are able to pass this proposal that Senator Baucus has put forward. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.